Hello. Hello and welcome everyone. Once again, it's great to see so many people joining this GIJN Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on investigating the pandemic. So welcome. I see a lot of people joining at the moment, and I'm speaking slowly so I can keep welcoming people coming into this webinar, part of our series on investigating the pandemic. In this webinar, we are bringing together 5 very experienced journalists to share their tips on how to survive, even thrive in the pandemic as freelancers. It's very tough being a freelance journalist at the best, or an independent producer for that matter, at the best of times. So obviously times are even tougher now for many. My name is Anne Koch, and I'm the Program Director at the Global Investigative Journalism Network, GIJN, and I am the moderator today. The pandemic has accelerated difficulties facing journalists and journalism, in fact, and it's a particularly tough time at the moment for freelancers and independents, even though they produce some of the best investigative stories. So how can they continue to do their great work and make a living? And what strategies and resources can help them? And that's what we're talking about today. We've got a great panel who I will introduce in a moment. But first, for those people joining this webinar, this GIJN webinar for the first time, and sorry to those who've heard my spiel before, I just wanted to give you a bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. It's the largest network of nonprofit investigative journalist organizations. We have 184 member organizations in 77 countries. But as we like to remind people, we work with journalists everywhere, whether they're in the commercial sector or in nonprofits, or of course, freelancers. So that is us. And related to this webinar, we've recently published guides, in fact, this week, that are relevant, I think, to those interested in freelancing. One called Freelancing Investigative Journalism, How to Pitch, and a second one on tips and strategies freelancing during the pandemic. We'll put those up in the chat box, and I think they're helpful. So to today's speakers, finally, I'm really delighted that we've been joined by 5 senior journalists, 4 with hard-won years of freelance experience, and 1 who has commissioned and worked with freelancers and independents for decades. They'll each share their tips and strategies for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll take your questions from the audience. So Emmanuel Freudenthal, our first speaker, is a freelance investigative reporter based in Nairobi, who has conducted investigations across Africa for more than a decade. 2 of his corruption investigations have led to ongoing police inquiries in Australia and Canada, and his stories have been published by numerous international outlets. Our second speaker is Safa Al Ahmad. Safa is a Saudi freelance investigative journalist and filmmaker. Her BBC documentary about a mass uprising in Saudi Arabia's eastern province brought international attention to the violence meted out to demonstrators, and she's now working on an investigative podcast on the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Safa has also served on the board of the London-based Frontline Freelance Register, which is run by freelance journalists. And our third speaker, Fisayo Soyombo, is a Nigerian freelance investigative journalist who focuses on exposing corruption and injustice. Among recent works, he tracked corruption in the Nigerian criminal justice system and spent 2 weeks in a police station and in prison as part of the investigation. Previously, Fisayo was editor at the Cable, Sahara Reporters, and the International Center for Investigative Reporting in Nigeria. Our fourth speaker, Cecilia Anesi, is an Italian investigative journalist, and after working briefly as a freelance reporter, she co-founded the Investigative Reporting Project Italy. She has investigated such topics as corruption, fraud, and organized crime, including the award-winning investigative documentary Toxic Europe. Cecilia has worked on many cross-border investigations with other organizations around the world. And Tom Giles, our final speaker, is Controller of Current Affairs at ITV in the UK, one of the largest national commercial media companies focusing on television. At ITV, he is responsible for commissioning current affairs programs and factual documentaries. Tom previously was editor of Panorama, which is the BBC Television's weekly flagship investigative program, and he himself also has made many television documentaries. So we have a fantastic panel today, and we also want to hear from you in the audience, and we'd ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see, which you can see on your screen below. We'll get to as many questions as we can. You can also ask questions in Russian and in Arabic, and we'll translate them for our panelists. And you can start asking questions anytime. Please note, we'll share some of the presentations and slides and so on. And my final point before we start is just to let you know that we're recording this webinar. It'll be put up on YouTube and Facebook. So again, thanks everyone for joining. And I'd like to start with Emmanuel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to, I guess I can't really say meet you, but thanks for coming. So I've been a freelance journalist for about 5 years. Although I was doing investigations earlier for about a decade. So I'll share a few tips on how I've been making a living so far. And this obviously will be just about my own experience and solutions that I've found and that worked for me. Each journalist will have a different background and different skill sets, and we each approach these challenges in different ways. So there's not like one right way to to make a living as a freelance investigative journalist. Prior to doing journalism, I was working for NGOs doing investigations, and so that's also why I'm only doing investigations now, because that's kind of what I'm good at doing. As a journalist, I pretty much use a very wide range of approaches. So I've used anything from writing code to analyze flight data to trekking in the rainforest in Cameroon with armed group for a week, and anything in between. So I like to use a lot of different methods. But this presentation isn't so much about the methods I use, it's about how I earn money. So about money, I don't have any other gigs. I don't have, a rich wife or a trust fund. So all I do is journalism. I think having side gigs is an issue when you're a journalist, because it raises all kinds of conflicts of interest when you do that. And I've actually refused a bunch of jobs or tasks, I guess, because of that. But I managed to earn enough to have a decent life, pay for my rent, take holidays once in a while, and it's worked for me so far. So maybe some of the things that I've been doing will also work for you. With the epidemic so far, I've been quite lucky. I haven't been very affected because I was working on desk-based stories or on the desk-based end of stories. And so this hasn't affected me too much, except for one trip that I had to cancel. But overall, I want to preface everything, no matter how many tips I can give you right now is really not a very good time to get into freelance, into journalism in general, and especially freelance journalism. So if you are thinking of doing that and leaving your job, maybe you should definitely consider the timing is not the best. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how the situation of freelance journalism. So it's really not a good way to become rich, unless maybe you own a newspaper, then arguably you're already rich. But as a freelance journalist, you often compete with staff journalists, you compete with other freelancers, and that makes it extra difficult to earn a living. the staff journalists already have a wage. So in a way, the stories that they've pitched to their outlet are already paid for. So it's, you know, I don't want to undermine how difficult it is, but basically they have definitely a foot in the door. So as a result of that, maybe freelance journalists are overall paid much less than staff journalists, according to what I've read online. But of course, this depends on everyone, and there's no limit to how much you can work as a freelance journalist. So you could work 24 hours a day, and you know maybe that can balance your income up. And also, obviously, it depends what kind of work you do and how you negotiate your income. The situation because of COVID is worse. It's affected, the epidemic has affected a lot of media houses. We see a lot of people getting laid off. And of course, freelancers are the easiest budget cuts because you just need to stop commissioning us rather than fire someone who you've hired. And so I'm guessing that freelancers are going to be the most heavily affected by the epidemic.
Emmanuel, tell us about what we're seeing on the
practical.
screen. Tell us what we're seeing on the screen.
This is yeah, apologies. I thought it was so it's a graphic representation of freelancing. The freelancer is a little train, and it's basically you just have to you know, you live day by day. Putting the
build the track one day ahead. Yeah.
crashing.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry for not explaining it earlier. So the first, probably the most important part of freelancing as a journalist, or being a journalist in general, is the stories that you write. And as a freelancer, it's very important to have really good stories that you can sell. And that's one thing that is important to stress, is that although journalism is a calling for many, it's also a business, especially if you're freelancing. And if you don't see it as a business, then it'll be very hard for you to make a living. Some people are quite shy to ask for money for the work that they're doing, and that's not going to be sustainable unless you have a trust fund or something like that. So there's quite a lot of resources, as you pointed out earlier on. GIJN is a very good, very thorough guide on how to pitch, and especially in times of COVID. And you know, I'm not going to go into details on that, because I think there's enough out there that you can find. But I want to talk a bit more about how you choose a story, and you know, yeah, basically choose the stories that will be both a good story, and but also specifically a good story for your kind of business as a freelance journalist. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. The first thing is the story has to be doable. There's a tricky balance between researching your story too much and spending, you know, way too much time on it, and not researching your story enough, and it turns out not to be doable. I mean, I personally have spent 1 month researching one story that I never sold, and that's obviously, as a staff journalist, you might get in trouble with your boss, maybe you get fired, I don't know, but as a freelancer, that's 1 month where you don't get paid. So it has to be doable. It also has to be, like any story, it has to be not boring, so you can pitch it to your family or your friends, and if they find it boring, it's most likely is. Another thing that is, I think, quite crucial, especially for freelance journalists, is to pitch the story at the right time. So again, you know, not do a month of research for a story before you pitch it, unless otherwise you might end up not getting paid. But at the same time, it's also quite bad if you pitch a story and then you're not able to complete it. And maybe you've spent, I don't know, several $1,000s going in flights and hotels, and then your story actually doesn't lead anywhere. That's a big issue, because you know, as a freelancer, you're just selling that one story, and if you can't deliver on what you've sold, you're very unlikely to work with that editor ever again. So you have to find that balance, and it's not easy to explain how to find it. But the best kind of advice I can give you is to have a minimum story, some things that you know for sure that you're going to be able to deliver, and be really clear about what you already have and what you hope to have to find, thanks to if you spend more time on the story, so that it's not a surprise to the editor. Now, the next big question is, once you have that story, or you've done enough research that you think you can pitch that story, how do you then sell it? Where do you find the money, someone to pay for your time, basically? This is a note. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but because the section is about money. So the usual place to find money, of course, is a news outlet, TV, and so on. Like Tom will probably explain to us how to get his money. But the issue is that at the moment, a lot of media outlets don't have money themselves, and that's also why they have to let go of a lot of their staff, or have to do less ambitious reporting. And in France specifically, it's really hard to do investigations because outlets pay per word, and it's very fixed. And so, of course, if you get paid per word, it's better to just go to a press conference and report what was said than do investigations. So what I've been doing is I've been combining that with grants, and there's a whole bunch of grants that you can get out there. They're usually quite competitive, but it's one outlet for investigative stories specifically. IJN has a good section on grant making opportunity, and I'm sure GIJN also has some resources on that. One thing to keep in mind when you're going for a grant is that they have different priorities to news outlets. One of the main things that they want usually is to be able to show that to their funders that your story had some kind of impact, and so you need to be able to show that to them. That doesn't mean that you need to go into your story with a kind of activist mindset. That would definitely not be a good idea. But you need to be able to show that, you know, if you did a good story, usually people will talk about it. It will generate some discussion, sometimes some changes. So you need to be able to report on that. Another key things to keep in mind as you're talking to these people, whether outlets or grant makers, as a freelance journalist, is that you have to sell yourself as well as your story. When your staff, obviously, they hired you already, so you don't need to, you know, they already know you. But as a freelancer, especially if you haven't worked with that outlet before, you need to explain to them why you're the right person to do that story, and that you'll be able to do it. I hope that helps. This is a very fast track kind of presentation of how to make a living as a freelance investigative journalist. Yeah, and I hope it was helpful.
Thank you. Yes, I know you could talk a lot longer about each and every element you raised, but thanks for doing that overview. And there's more material on our website. But yeah, very good way of establishing some of the main issues. Yeah, I think we'll turn right now to Safa to keep going. Safa, yeah, thanks. You've turned your microphone on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Safa Al Ahmad. As Anne has said in the introduction, I'm a Saudi freelance journalist, but in actuality, I work less on Saudi and more on Yemen. And I'm talking about the context of COVID and how to survive during this. It has been especially difficult for me as a filmmaker to continue working during this time, because I usually work on development for quite a long time, and then I fly to Yemen to do my project. So that's obviously out the window for many reasons. And so I've luckily had 2 tracks going at the same time, and I'll talk about both of them and how that has been impacted by the realities of the constraints of the pandemic. So with the inability to physically go to Yemen, I've had to be more creative in thinking of how do I continue doing stories that I feel very strongly about in Yemen, that even before the pandemic was an extremely difficult country to access. And the same thing for Saudi. That has been the case for me personally for quite a long time, because after my my film that Anne had alluded to, the Saudi secret uprising in 2014, the Saudi government accused me of supporting terrorism and have not been able to go back into the country since then. And so on many tracks, it's led me to be slightly more prepared for this pandemic than I expected, because I had to think creatively about how to continue doing investigative stories on countries that are deliberately trying to stop me from physically entering. And that has led to a lot of interesting challenges as a filmmaker, obviously, but also forcing me out of thinking of my stories, the investigative stories, as only something that I should go physically film, but how to think of different creative ways of telling that story in a way that can build up to eventually getting to the point where I can afford going back and doing a film. And so last year, I went through this really interesting experience of trying to do an investigative podcast. And if the people who speak Arabic on this platform right now will know that the tradition of podcasts in general in Arabic is quite new as a concept, but also specifically documentaries, audio documentaries, and investigative strain of documentary podcast is extremely new. So I think the podcast I did last year, which is on Jamal Khashoggi's murder, was quite a unique experience in that way, but forced me to think creatively about how to do things remotely. And this will lead me to what I think every freelance journalist right now that is doing investigative journalism, that is forced to do it remotely, that is not doing it in the natural habitat they find themselves in right now, is digital security. Digital security is paramount right now. That I think we as freelancers are on the back foot of everybody that is a staffer that already works within a system where they get their own laptops, they get clean cell phones on assignments, they already get all the electronics that have been cleaned for them before. I mean, hopefully. I'm assuming that, like, for example, with the BBC and stuff, when you come back from an assignment, you give them back and they wipe everything, or they should be wiping everything. So at least you have an institution that is responsible for your digital hygiene. With freelancing, and specifically now I find myself in a country, I got stuck in a country that I don't technically live in. And so I've had to compromise a lot about the space I have no longer any control over. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are finding themselves in, regardless of journalism, where we're all trying to deal with the physical realities of this pandemic and how to keep ourselves safe in it. And that, and one of the major things I struggled with as a freelancer is, for example, health insurance. Health insurance is a massive thing. So even the health insurance we used to be able to get on assignment as freelancers through Frontline Freelance Register or ACOS, they're not covering the pandemic because it's not possible to cover a pandemic. And so we are extremely vulnerable as a group right now, because even the organizations that are supposed to be trying to help freelancers are all struggling. We're all struggling together. And even with the institutions that are dealing with freelancers, and I'm sure Tom will speak more to that, especially that he has a freelancer in the US, and the US is terrible when it comes to health insurance. So that aside, the digital security issue became really difficult for me, because now I'm having to communicate with people in countries that already have a high level of censorship, especially Saudi Arabia is well known for not only spying on all its people, but paying a shitload of money on programs through NSO, for example, to get programs like Pegasus to spy on journalists and activists. They not only hack into our private communication, but they also, physically actually hack journalists in consulates as well. So they've shown that they will go a really extreme length to stop stories from coming out, or stop journalists or individuals that they believe should be silenced, to such a degree that it's become something that you have to think quite actively. I'm obviously, as Emmanuel, I'm speaking from my own personal experience in the stories I do. Every one of us has to calculate their own personal risk of what they think their stories are exposing themselves to, but also regardless of your story, realize who is trying to watch you. And the policies of different governments differ, right? And so even if I don't think I as a person is doing anything of any significance, if there's a track record of this government trying to silence journalists and stories, then you should be ahead of the game on that. It is your responsibility to keep ahead of your digital hygiene. That said, my financial problem, and this is where Emmanuel alluded to the business element of this, and this is the challenge with, for me at least, is the money that is required for me as a freelancer to keep a burner phone for safety, to keep a burner laptop for safety, to have the proper VPNs, to have tails, to have virtual machines on your laptop. So then when you're investigating something online, you keep yourself safe, but also the people you're communicating with. That is an especial challenge for me because, like, I mean, it's amazing. In the first world, you don't think of things like, is there enough electricity? So then if I put all these passwords and security on my laptop and my hard drives, once I'm in a country like Yemen, where there's very little electricity, if you fully encrypt your hard drive, it takes a shitload of electricity. And so you have less access to the time on your laptop and your hard drives when you're in location, right? And so I didn't even think about it when I was setting up to go on assignment. I show up there and I'm like, oh, right, now I can't properly edit my footage. I can barely scroll through it before everything cuts down. So thinking of those things is vital, and there's a luxury of keeping in mind where you are and where you're going and what that digital security means for you, and how low tech you need to think back on where am I going, and does it make sense, the security precautions in the country I am setting up versus the place I'm going, right? When you're stuck in one place, and if you are flagged as somebody that they're going to keep an eye on, and you're not using a VPN, you're not keeping your laptop safe, even if you think I have nothing to hide, in actuality, you have a duty of care to everybody you communicate with. And so you have to think of these things quite methodically of how clean am I? Who am I communicating with? Am I exposing them indirectly just because I think I am safe here in the location I'm communicating with? The person I'm communicating with, are they safe to talk to me? And that's especially the case with Saudi, because just communicating with me is a crime. People have been taken to court and I've been named in their court cases, right? And so you have to be aware of the stories you start doing right now. So I'm obviously bypassing Emmanuel's presentation of how to get commissioned, right? So let's say you did get a commission, you did get a story, and you're doing it on Saudi or Yemen or Egypt. I think is the same security profile when it comes to digital security. How are all these things impacting how you work? And that for me was fundamental, because like I'm used to just going there physically. So I'm just setting up an appointment on the phone, and then everything else is offline, right? That option is no longer there for me. Everything has to be online. That is such a huge problem for me of guaranteeing anonymity, guaranteeing the safety of this person. Because when you're offline, you kind of have more control of your environment and who's listening. Online, I can't do that, right?
Yeah,
I can't even have off the record conversations with people that I can safely say, this is completely off record, this is deep background, right? And so all of these things you have to be hyper aware of right now when you're setting up these investigations, that I didn't have to worry about as much before, because I had the option of saying, let's not talk on over the phone, even if it's over Signal or something encrypted. Let's just meet face to face. You build that trust. You get to know this person. You have your gut instinct as a journalist. Is this person lying to me? Are they trying to use me? How will they look in the film? Like, there's so many levels of this communication that you're stripped from. And so it is it's more of what not to do now, and to be hyper aware of all these things as you're trying to work these stories. And it is, even with the podcast, it's been really difficult to do the interviews, right? Because people are more likely to say things to you when they see you, right? There's a trust that you build. When I'm just talking online with someone to do an interview with, which is the beauty of the podcast, so you never have to physically be anywhere technically, right? But with that comes the challenge of accuracy. Is this as accurate? Like even in Yemen, when I shot something, I was there, and still when I'm in the edit room, the self-doubt eats you of the investigation of like, did I get it right? Did I miss something? There was a gut check that you can say, no, but I was there. But now that you can't even say, I was there, you're relying on secondary information basically constantly. And that frightens me. It's like, how do I continue having a higher level of confidence in the stories and in the investigations? Because I don't do what Emmanuel does. I get fully commissioned before I do the story. And so the pressure that comes with that is quite high to begin with, especially in a country like Yemen and Saudi, where the facts are deliberately hidden by the government. You can't just go online and check things, because those facts and figures are politicized or controlled. And so now I'm trying to think back on how to keep making it as a living, by saying the podcast, the article, these things will work as a recce for a future film, right? And so I haven't given up on the topics of the investigations, but I have to piggyback different forms of the story to come to the point where I can make it into a film. So then I can
So Safa, I mean, I think you're raising some really good issues around how difficult it has been in this pandemic and the lockdown or whatever, the lack of travel, which has made things much worse. And the security issue, the fact that there's a lack of support for freelance offer in terms of institutional support, and also how you interview and check on facts. I think these are all really difficult things. I mean, can you just end now perhaps by giving us your top main suggestions to our audience in this context? I mean, security is obviously one of your suggestions. You just have to do it. But
you have to be hypervigilant,
yeah,
right?
okay.
And this is to me, it's like what you used to think is safe, I think is no longer that.
Yeah.
Right. But also be creative about. I know I saw Pika and Fisayo's presentation about the niche. The niche is important, but the niche also can make you frozen in a way. Like this is what you used to be doing. Be more creative about what you think you can do, leading you to eventually, inshallah, getting to the point where you can come back into it. Especially for me as films, like I can't imagine doing these stories. Like I really wanted it as a documentary, but now I have to compromise. I'm going to do it as a podcast first, because that's the only physically feasible thing for me now, to not starve.
Okay, well, that's there's a lot of interesting suggestions there, I think, and it's a good segue to Fisayo, who actually I think has a different view of this niche question, like whether you should be an expert in one or two areas or be more flexible or creative, as you called it. Yeah. May I turn to Fisayo now to share? I think you have a page to share with us, don't you? So thank you very much, Safa. Really interesting. Absolutely on the money. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So I will be speaking on some of the things that have helped me before I get to the page. So basically, this is about how to survive at a time when globally we are dealing with a pandemic. Reality is that newspapers are laying off staff because they have smaller budgets. And then a lot of times when journalists ask themselves what they can do to survive, they are trying to get part of the same funding to the media that is shrinking. So basically my strategy would be, how can journalists, while doing their jobs, get some of those funds that should go to the media, that isn't going to the media at the moment? How can they tap from those funds. There are 6 things that I think journalists can do. I'm going to start from the third because I think it's the most important. Also, I'll be speaking to 2 classes of people who have been into freelancing for a while and just need 1 or 2 adjustments, and also those who are just starting. Most important thing I'm going to say is that this is a time when journalists have to reinvent themselves. They have to, you are the journalist, but now you can also become the newspaper, because everyone understands that usage of social media has risen since the start of the pandemic. More and more people are spending time on social media, using the internet, and it's an opportunity for journalists to evolve, But then reinventing yourself isn't possible if, for instance, you haven't mastered a niche. I always advise journalists to master a niche. If you came to Nigeria and you asked for maybe 10 investigative journalists, I like to think, or maybe 5, I like to think my name would crop up. If you then say you want undercover journalists, if you mention 3, I like to think 1 or 2 people would mention my name. And then if you say you want a journalist who would hear of a case of injustice or corruption and instantly wants to report it, I like to think my name would be mentioned as well. So journalists have to, I'm not saying people have to do exactly what I've done, but people have to ask themselves, what do I want to be known for? What kind of journalist do I want to be? What kind of journalist will someone need to talk to? And I'm sure that in my country, in my region, if they're mentioning 3, 5, 10 names, my name can come up. So every journalist has to decide that. Journalists have to establish a track record. So profiting from freelancing in a time like this is not going to be smooth without a track record. If no one knows you, if it's hard to say this is the kind of journalism you do, it's going to be a lot difficult, and it's not going to happen overnight. So for those who are just starting, it's not a bad idea if someone now is thinking of establishing a track record, because at any rate, no one knows when this pandemic will be over. We are all hopeful it's going to be over in a few months, but no one is exactly sure. So it's never too late to really think about reporting consistently and excellently enough to have that track record. So back to number 3, which is reinventing yourself. So before this pandemic, what was I doing? I officially became a freelance journalist in July 2019. Before then, I held editor positions at 1 or 2 newspapers. And then with freelancing, what I did was to pitch my ideas to local newspapers, and hard as it is to believe, I literally told them what I wanted to earn. And one strategy I adopted was to show why I was the only person. A lot of times it won't be possible to show you are the only person, but you can be one of the few persons. But in my case, I could show that I was the only person who could do those stories. And literally, my funding suggestions were what we went for. But when when coronavirus happened, I had to reinvent myself, because I saw that I was getting tips from all over the country, from at least every geopolitical zone. In Nigeria, I would get tips and people would speak to me, and all I needed to do was work my sources and get more information. And then I started what I called Fisayo's COVID-19 series. This was me thinking, I'm not just going to wait till when I can pitch an idea to a newspaper and get funding. I'm going to use my social media platforms to report in bits. And I was doing Twitter threads, on injustice, on cover-up, on malfeasance in government places, in hospitals, in agencies related to COVID-19. And I saw my social media audience begin to grow. Effectively, I continued as a journalist, but I also became a newspaper on social media, Twitter in particular. Now, what has happened? I've had an international funder reach out to me to say, we like what they're doing with COVID-19 series. We want to help you expand. And we are talking, we are almost at the end of that phase, because they felt if a lot of Nigerians want to get COVID-19 reporting that is not general news. They can go to the timeline of Fisayo Soyombo and get it. And so why not expand what he's doing rather than, approach a newspaper? So it opened my eyes to the possibility of journalists remaining as journalists, but also taking advantage of the social media to become the newspaper. Because when people know that you're reliable, when people know that you get investigative stories, even if they are short and brief and in bits, your audience continues to grow. And what does the average funder, what do they want to do with their money? They want some objectives reached and they want impact. And once you can boast of, once you can show that as an individual, impact is possible, funding will not be the most difficult thing in the world. Also, I advise journalists in this season to position themselves strategically. What is your niche and what is happening in that niche? Even if you are not reporting, what do you have to say about what is going on? I report corruption. The acting head of Nigeria's anti-corruption agency was arrested a few days ago, and I put out my opinion on it. If it's your beat, then you don't have to. I'm not saying you have to show your face when when anything is trending, but if something is your beat, don't be in the background. Don't take the backseat all the time. Talk on that thing you are passionate about reporting, so that if someday there's a gathering of people who want to set up something nice, or who need a journalist to expose something, they can remember that because at the end of the day, if no one remembers you, I'm not saying be publicity crazy. I'm not saying hug the limelight all the time. But with what is your job, don't hide away. And as a matter of fact, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to share opinions that are unpopular. But if it's your beat, don't be in hiding. And when you do these things, a lot of times journalists can earn more than they do, but they underprice themselves, and I've deliberately included this point. I know for a lot of journalists, the first thing is even how to get by at all. So for any job that comes at any rate, they are willing to take it. But it can happen that rather than two small offers, you can have one slightly big offer and then use the rest of your time for something more productive. And also for journalists who are just starting out, who are having a hard time, they need to know that it is possible to get to a point where you can be fine, where you can literally say what you want to earn, regardless of how difficult it is for everyone else. You can get to a point where you say, no, I'm sorry, I would really like to do this, but this is what you have to pay me to get this job done. Don't underprice yourself. If you are that journalist of value, you need money. People who have legitimate money also have legitimate needs that only a journalist can meet. So don't always underprice yourself. And then always, it's a time when things will continue to change. I think every now and then there will be slight changes. The journalist has to continue evolving. Before COVID-19, a journalist could say, I'm a kind of journalist, a kinds of stories are the things I want to do. This is how I like to operate. But in this season, the strategy is that we have to keep asking ourselves, what exactly can we do next? If tomorrow I feel I'm underutilizing YouTube, for my stories, I could, yes, be more active on YouTube. Essentially, it's not a time to get stuck in our ways. We always have to keep evolving. But like I said earlier, most important thing is that we have to understand that it's a time when we can be journalists, but at the same time, we can also be the newspaper.
Great, thank you very much. Very, very interesting suggestions there. And also reflecting on the fact that quite a lot of journalism now is funded by nonprofits and supported by nonprofits and foundations, and there's opportunities there. Thank you. So Cecilia, you came up with a different solution, or have come up with some different solutions. Let's turn to you now.
Yes, I'll share my screen to try and get to the presentation.
Just while you're doing that, just to say to the audience, we're going to run a little longer, I think, today than possible, but we're getting some good questions in and we're going to make time for them. We normally don't have such a richness of presenters and speakers, so we're just going to run a little over today. Go ahead. Yeah, Cecilia. It looks good. We do. It looks excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, I've been freelancing for about a decade, but most of my time I haven't been doing this alone. Actually, I've been doing this with a bunch of other freelancers with whom we organized. And in 2012, we founded basically a center for investigative reporting in our country, which is Italy, that lacked an organization of that type. So we were the first ones in to create such a center on the model that we could see abroad in a lot of different countries, especially the US, the UK, and so on and so forth. Why did we come up with this idea? Well, the global network has a weight on that, because we went to the first, for us it was the first global conference that year in Kiev, and we figured out that known Italian media had sent any reporter to the conference. So there was only freelancers from Italy there. And we thought, okay, you know, like maybe we can get together and do something good here. Also because it was, at the time, it was really hard to get stories out on papers in our country. And even if freelancer would manage, they would be paid super little. We're talking about like €5 per piece or a little more. The more you will get to be known and respected and be considered a reliable journalist, you could even be able and pitch something bigger. But the maximum we even as a team ever got paid by an Italian media is €1,000 before taxes, of course. So that doesn't really cover your work as a freelancer, especially if we're talking about investigative reporting that might take months and might have a lot of expenses, especially if you travel. So that's how we thought about getting together. And we were asked a lot of times, yes, but then if you share that little money, then you get paid less. That's true, but at the same time, we were able to follow more stories at the same time, which meant that overall, in the end, we had more money we could count on. So we sort of, you know, got all this effort together in one pot, and then this pot would pay us. And also, this meant more manpower and more context, and it was possible to sort of enlarge the amount of not only the audience but the amount of media we could contact and convince running our stories. Also, we could count on different languages because we are all Italians, but we speak different languages. So you have English, Spanish, French, and so on and so forth. Also, the other important thing is that once you get together and you fund an organization, then if you fund it as a nonprofit center, you're able to fundraise with grants and foundations, as we were saying before. So that really was a game changer for us. I have to say, we have been existing for about 8 years. We never managed to get funding from Italy in the nonprofit world, because that doesn't exist virtually. Only once we managed to fund a documentary with a foundation in Italy, but beyond that, it's just impossible. So most of our grants come from abroad, or recently we're getting citizens' donations as well. There are other reasons why we think getting together with other freelancers is winning as a strategy. Well, we think there are less risks because whoever you're reporting on knows that you're not alone. So obviously they can attack you, as Safa was saying before, digitally or even physically or with lawsuits. But at least they want to attack only one person. There is a team, so you're less of a target. And then, well, obviously you have more impact because, again, you can do bigger stories, you can have more context and increase your impact. But also, we say in the end, you have more fun. And when sometimes this job can be really hard, as all of you know, the panelists, but also the people connected, I'm sure we all know that. Sometimes it can be really frustrating, especially when you become a target and things go wrong, you might have a very expensive or long lawsuit. Being alone can be really depressing, and yes, there are organizations that can help you with that, but it's better to be in a team with people who have been sharing the same things with you. And also, when you talk to sources, sometimes you do get in contact with really hard stories of maybe victims of wars or sexual abuses, and it becomes good to have colleagues you can talk to and you share that burden with. So this has been our solution. Although IRPI is a center that covers a lot of different topics, we thought that it was good to have some sort of ties to our geographical area. So we either started covering, for example, Italian mafias abroad or foreign mafias in our country. Not only, of course, but we try always to do some sort of look at some elements that makes it have sense to work with us instead of somebody else from the world. And then this year, actually under the pandemic, we had a big change because we started having our own media. For the way the law works in our country, you cannot run publications unless you're a registered media at a tribunal. So for all these years, we were only, yes, we were a non-profit center, but we could not run our own content. We always had to pitch it to media and convince this media to publish it, and obviously to pay us as well. Although that hasn't always been very successful, as my colleagues before have mentioned. So we decided that we needed to change that thing, not only because of the funding, because to be fair, most of our funding in the end was coming from foundations or grants because media industry pays too little. But more than anything, we needed it for the space. Like we wanted to run our own content and stop having always to convince somebody that the story was good. And that's how we funded IRPI Media. We had decided to launch this media for about 1.5 years. And then we had decided to launch it in February. And COVID-19 hit Italy. We were, as you know, after China, the first country to be hit. But we decided to go on anyways. So in a way, it was good because a lot of people were already stuck in their homes, so they had a bit more time to read. But at the same time, we were faced with, this is the platform, we were faced with a challenge that was, what are we gonna do? You know, like, are we gonna report on COVID or not? So I'll get to that back in a second, but yes, we had to start switching on COVID as well. But we thought we cannot just report on COVID the way any media would do it. We have to find our way. And that's why in these years, we try to create an expertise, and we think that's key to success. Again, either like we did it linked to our geographical area. So like we're not only in Italy, but we're in the Mediterranean, so we try to cover that thing, but also on specific topics. So yes, we cover mafias, but even more narrow down, like within mafias, there is a lot of different types of mafias, and there is a lot of different type of activities. So we try to like narrow that thing down and become as expert as possible on certain specific things. And that paid back. It wasn't immediate, but in the long run, it does pay back. We all started as fixers. I know it might be frustrating because you don't sign your stories. I mean, the stories you work on as a fixer, but it does create a lot of good context that you might use later on, and it does bring in very good and easy money. So that's one of the solutions we found, and then it will allow you also to somehow in the years, like now none of us really does fixing anymore, but we do have younger reporters who are trying to, you know, who are in the position we were a few years ago, and that we can engage and get the fixing done by them. So you still don't lose the context with the big media, BBC, Al Jazeera, whatever. So they're happy because they get the work done in Italy, and the young freelancers are helped that way. So we're trying to keep the network running in a way. yeah, again, like, well, I have to be honest. We were supposed to sign a few big contracts before the pandemic hit, because the idea was to employ some young freelancers and more people in our center. This was completely stuck. So at the moment, we are a bit struggling with that, but we think that growing a bit will help us covering more stories, because we keep getting not only a lot of different suggestions by audience, but also by colleagues from all over the world. So the more manpower you have as a group of organized freelancers, the more you can report and have impact. During COVID-19 pandemic, yes, as I was saying before, we had to shift. We had to initially only, we could see like mainstream media in Italy were covering the pandemic by going to hospitals and you know, trying to do the breaking news. And although a lot of this reporting was done by freelancers. And here I want to just steal like 30 seconds of your attention that a lot of colleagues that we know were freelancers were there in the first like moments of the pandemic in front of hospitals, and I think they really risked their life. They really didn't have, I mean, they, as Safa was saying before, with laptops, these people had to buy their own masks, their own gloves. Yeah, there was whatsoever no training on how to do that. It's been really useful for some, like online, there were some suggestions, but as we were the first country, I must say, like, I was looking at these colleagues and feeling really sorry for them. We on our side were lucky because doing investigation, we really didn't need to go on the spot. But we thought, what can be our role, you know? So we started looking into public contracts because we thought investigative reporting could be useful for the pandemics, especially in a country that has one of the highest rates of corruption. And I think that is not something possible for one freelancer. So if you have something like this in your country, get together with others, because the amount of data, here's just a screenshot, the amount of data that we had to face and we're still facing is just really big. This is just a screenshot of, I don't remember how many rows of contracts that we got from different websites, because obviously the government hasn't just released one sole website with the contracts. We had to go and pick it up from different sources. And then in the majority of these contracts, you would not have the winner of the tender written down. So we had to scout for, we're still scouting, like, so it's 2.5 months that we're doing this job. And it's something one person alone can totally not do. So I would advise you to do this type of work if you're interested, but get together with others. Yeah, this is, in the end, we came out with one page. Maybe when I exit the PowerPoint, I'll show you a bit more. One page on our website that collects a lot of different stories. And we didn't only focus on contracts, but also on our expertise that it's been the mafia. So we checked on how the drugs, like cocaine trade is being affected by pandemics or what else. So one suggestion is, if you're expert on something, go and check how that topic you really know well, it's being affected by the virus, by the pandemic. This is our URL. And yes, again, most of the stories we did on COVID were it's things we didn't do alone. So there were either ideas that we found and then we share with other colleagues or like other groups, OCCRP or other networks, or things that colleagues asked us to look into together. So again, the network here is super important, and also try and check what others don't. So we found stories where most mainstream media weren't looking at. So for example, with a story on rapid test for COVID-19, the prick test, and mainstream media weren't really looking into that. Like, yes, they were reporting on, why is the government not using this test? They could be really good. That was it. So we thought, that's weird, because mainstream media in Italy were getting adverts, like they were getting paid to write those stories. And we thought there might be a business there. So we started looking into that. And so in a way, mainstream media can be also suggesting you good investigations. Again, we already said that the expertise, and talk to your old sources. By old, I mean the sources you usually talk to for other stories. They might know something on how, you know, if they're cops, but even just doctors or whoever really. They might be carpenters who might tell you, you know what, like during COVID-19 or right now, I don't know, we're not throwing the waste in the same place as before. I mean, there might be a story there. And yeah, very briefly, I just want to add something that is not on the PowerPoint, which is, I think I got this idea while Safa was talking, and we had problems. Yes, digital security is always a concern, but for us it's always been there as a concern. But there is another concern, which is physical security. The fact that a lot of us can be stuck in one place, whereas before we were very used to like just jump from one place to another. That brings up another concern, which is physical security, because people you report on might know where you live. And well, that's a concern for any local reporter usually, but for freelancers who are used to travel the world, it isn't really a big concern. Now it is. So maybe, you know, get organized as safely as possible. Maybe get a camera, like a surveillance camera. You can buy it online, 20, 30 euros, install it, or just an alarm or something. That's something you should take into consideration. And then, for example, for the health insurance problem, yes, like we haven't been traveling until a few weeks ago. And we did it slow, like we did not take a plane, we took a car, it took us 10 hours to get to a place. But yes, everything is changing. It can be more costly, of course, but maybe try and find different ways of traveling than before, just until things are getting better. And one last thing, since we couldn't travel, we're working on a podcast project with voices of people who were out there traveling. It was something that came up because we knew people who were like Italians who were traveling back from India to Italy, and we got them to record everything for us. The quality might not be perfect, but in the end you have a good documentation. So that might be an option too, you know, when Fisayo was saying get creative, I mean, use whoever is out there as your eyes. So yeah, this is my tips, and then we'll wait for questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Celia. Really interesting. I think both you and Fisayo have talked about using old sources, which was fascinating. Tom, let's turn to you now. Yeah, please, from the point of view of someone who commissions freelance and independence, it'd be really interesting to hear your advice. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Anne. Very inspiring stuff. I thought I was going to have to give all the answers, but Cecilia appears to have worked it all out anyway. Who needs commissioners? On top of that, just before I start, Safa, I'd like to pay tribute to your incredible film in 2014. It was the Saudi uprising film. It was absolutely fantastic. So well done for that. Yeah, just to kick off, I'm Tom. I'm the head of current affairs and a factual commissioner at ITV, which is basically the UK's biggest commercial broadcaster. And before that, I was editor of the BBC's main investigative programme, Panorama, as well as having been a filmmaker and producer and series producer at the BBC for well over 20 years as well. I've not got any slides. I've got a few clips of some of the programmes that we do to give you a sense of what you would be sort of aiming towards, I guess, in terms of pitching. But before that, I'll just make a couple of basic points to try and give an overview as much as I can. First of all, current affairs and long-form factual investigations and filmmaking in that world are by their very nature collaborative. They have to be. For us, it's pretty expensive. And in UK broadcasting, at least because of things like Ofcom, it involves a great deal of legal compliance, which can be time consuming.
Sorry, so Ofcom is the UK regulator, broadcasting regulator. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah.
We got a global audience. Yeah,
I know.
Sorry.
I'll pitch wider. Anyway, for those reasons, we have to collaborate pretty often just to cover those sort of costs with other broadcasters or other journalistic organizations, whether that's, America's PBS, like WGBH we work with, or the Bureau of Investigative Journalism here, or even the ICIJ more globally. As for myself, I commission about 100 to 120 hours of programming a year of which it's only a relatively small amount of that is narrowly long-form investigative. The rest of it's docs, consumer programs, more general current affairs and politics. And most of that, nearly all our investigative ideas, I'd say, come from freelancers, independent production companies, freelance journalists, and program makers, of course. And usually they're via outside production companies. We do have a small core of staff inside ITV studios, but they're usually heavily supported by freelancers anyway, or those on freelance contracts. And frankly, that's really how most of the TV industry in the UK works. It's really only in the BBC that there's a large in-house investigative journalist presence. Most of the television industry is largely freelance in terms of investigations. So how do we work with those freelancers, perhaps potentially people like yourselves, especially on big international investigations, especially when things are currently so tricky because of COVID? Well, I mean, as Safa has already said, the answer to that is it's tricky anyway, frankly, at the best of times. And in some ways, COVID is a massive global story. And in some ways, that's sort of, it makes it slightly easier, which is in as much as a public service broadcaster, we and our journalists, who are deemed, it should be pointed out in Britain at least, essential workers, we have a responsibility to explain it. And to that extent, certainly inside the UK, we are actually enabled to do so. It's one of the things that, you know, makes our work. We were able right from the start of the pandemic to basically travel up and down the UK to report on what we needed to report on. There was never any problem with that, including doing investigative work. But it also means that responsibility is to report the rest of the world is greater than ever, which is why we're currently working on several longer-term COVID-19 documentaries. But at the same time, it's obviously been really hard for freelancers. And where we can, we're trying to collaborate with other broadcasters in the UK and with the small independent representatives like PACT to help the smaller independents who do the bulk of the sort of difficult niche investigative work and the freelancers behind them via development funds as best as we can. But I know it's been tough. I know many people in Britain are having trouble in terms of, you know, keeping commissions coming. They're considering leaving the industry. There's lots of issues. Safa mentioned travel. It's obviously much harder to get insurance now for productions generally. It's hard to get insurance for camera equipment, especially at the moment when insurance can point to TV companies and many in the supply chains who are running out of money or maybe going bust. But at the same time, though, that's hard. That can lead to opportunities globally for people on the ground. So, for example, quite a few from some of the commissioners finding it hard to send producer directors from the UK abroad, which actually leads to more opportunities for people based in the countries of origin to actually be the directors, be the camera people for these program makers. So in some ways, it may end up long-term that the whole COVID, what's happened with this crisis, could actually shake things up because of that. And perhaps it might even be liberating. But I think the other important thing is, as has been mentioned by others, is COVID is also so big that we don't want it to start crowding out other stories, because that's obviously the first thing that people will take advantage of. And we still need to find out about other things and need to work in the ways that we always have in terms of bringing freelancers and freelancers' ideas to us. So just to quickly go over, what I'll do is just explain how we normally work with freelancers, and then hopefully show two, possibly if I'm really clever, sneak in 3 clips. But we'll see. From previous work, I mean, it's the last couple of years of work. I've only been at ITV since 2015-16. So first of all are the group of freelancers who essentially come to us with their own ideas independently, which they then make into films for us. Now, that's quite a limited number of people who have that full capability. Sometimes they come to us completely independently. Sometimes they come to us via their own service production companies. And really to achieve that, you need experience, you need confidence, and it also helps to have a personal story and a personal edge to what you're trying to pitch. We have development budget, so we can give, but I would again emphasize that that's a small proportion of the wider development budget that I have for all programs. But we do have a small amount of development that we can give to clear pitches. And on terms of those pitches, I think the thing to stress to this audience is that the first thing is that it has to feel relevant, either relevant to our audience in the broadest sense, partly because of the importance, if you like, of the story internationally. It has to be pretty ambitious in terms of the scope, not too small in terms of its vision, if you like. Clear objective, as I think as Emmanuel said really clearly, it's got to be doable. And the more you can show a track record that shows that you can deliver in that way, the better. I think you have to as well be collaborative, willing to be collaborative. It's fantastically helpful if you can build or you have access to networks in countries that we're looking to investigate, obviously. I think finally, as has already been said, you do these days have to have a very strong awareness of digital security, very, very important, but also because of that, a willingness to follow the protocols that essentially I have to set down and form a framework around to make these sort of stories work. And if I get time to show you some of these things, you'll see why we need them so much. I was going to kick off with one of these people, Dia Khan, who's a twice Emmy award-winning filmmaker, although she's made all 4 of her films for us alone. She currently has 2 more in the pipeline in America, as I said before. And her films are interesting in as much as they're not partly investigative, but also their personal filmic journeys in which some ways perhaps only she can tell. She films them, she directs them. She has a partner who's a producer, but essentially she's the presenter as well. And we came to her, she originally came to us for another small production company, and then basically having broken through with that film, she set up her own smaller company, essentially, which basically pushes her own work through. And this next clip dates back to 2017, when she began talking to the alt-right and neo-Nazis in the US. Dia is of Pakistani heritage, although she's brought up in Norway. And she ended up in the middle of the Charlottesville riots. So I'm just going to show you, if I can make this work, how that film opened in the first two minutes or so.
My hair okay? It's not flying around in funny directions.
So as you know, I am a woman of color.
Yes.
Yes. I am the daughter of immigrants. I am a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
I am a feminist. I am a lefty liberal. I see your face. And what I want to ask you is, am I your enemy?
You're not subjectively my enemy, but what you are promoting will lead to the disappearance of my people and my culture. And I will tell you this, it annoys me tremendously when I'm told by some immigrant or a child of immigrants that the only reason my country is worthwhile is because people like them have come here. It's as if to say, my ancestors built a dung heap, and I don't doubt your goodwill, but your goodwill is objectively going to lead to the oblivion of my people. I'm sorry, there is no other way to see it.
My name is Dia Khan. I'm an activist and filmmaker. When I was 6 years old, my father took me to my first rally against racism and fascism. I grew up in Norway, where white skinhead gangs terrorized our small Muslim community. My father told us things would change, but extremism and racism are on the rise again in Europe and America. I decided to meet people who think the white race is under threat and that I am their enemy.
Fuck you! Get a heart attack, nigger!
I met neo-Nazis.
Jews and homosexuals, they should be exterminated, every single one of them. History will decide who is superior.
Men who say they've lived lives of racist violence.
Nigger, prepare to burn. You've attacked our people, and now it's your turn. I've hurt people horrifically with my bare hands. I've been to prison. I've kidnapped people. I've harmed people. I've done things that you would think I'm insane.
And I sat down with the new leaders of the white nationalist movement, men from privileged and elite backgrounds.
We did it. We took it. We took it with force. We won.
I joined the extremists on the front lines of the race wars in America. I wanted to see if I could understand their anger, to get to know the personal reasons why they are drawn to such hatred and division.
Fuck you!
Right, okay, well, that's that. I'll stop sharing. So there you go. That's obviously there's a lot more to explain about that film, but you got the general gist. What I was trying to show there was someone who comes to us with a very strong and powerful vision that they can bring in terms of a film. Now she's become over the last 4 or 5 years of sort of very accomplished filmmaker, but you know, she came in initially quite raw. She had access to a particular story about a particular honor killing related to the Kurdish community in the UK. Dia works effectively as a full freelance, and we support her work at the point of commission, because obviously to make a film like that in the end will cost probably just shy of £200,000 sterling for all the production, all the post-production and everything involved in it. And often that's supplemented by other platforms and other broadcasters. So she's received help and funds from a European cultural fund based in her home country of Norway, specifically for her films about Islam. And also post-broadcast, that particular film was shown on Netflix, as 1 or 2 of her films have also been. So that's one way of doing it. Obviously, you know, I accept that that's a sort of particularly, you know, one end of the scale in terms of what freelancers come to us with. I think the second story to talk to you about is a more conventional model for us. Usually what happens with our investigations, they come to us through relatively small, specialized independent production companies based in the UK, but often not just always in the UK, not exclusively. Companies like Harcash, Blateway, ITM Productions, True Vision, and they will have access to UK and international freelancers, but also to international partners. And essentially we commission those independents, and they bring in the freelancers that they know, or that we both know, or that I know and they'll know, to produce direct research, both here and abroad. And often, particularly when we go for sort of high-scale investigations on particular countries, when they have access to networks of journalists, to teams of expertise in the field that we will then delegate to and fund ourselves. And that's clearly where things like digital security are extremely important. The indie basically will, at that point, once we set out the commissioning parameters, they'll take over responsibility for the insurance around the program and for funding it via the commission. And for that reason, it's important that they're known. And I would stress to freelancers that it's really worth trying to find out who has made those sort of programs, the sort of programs that you're interested in being involved in, as places to go and see almost before you'd come to someone like me. Because if these are smaller outlets that have worked with us before and collaborated with before and produce, you know, striking programs, then they'll be that much more trusted going forward. Because obviously, particularly if you see the programs coming up, those can be difficult to fund and difficult to make. So this next film on that score was co-funded by WGBH Frontline in the US, and was made by a UK freelance journalist with others around both here and abroad, and was made for Harcash Productions. So this was filmed undercover early last year. I think it's the first time anyone had actually filmed independently undercover in Xinjiang in China, which, as you will probably know, has seen the biggest internment of any ethnic group since the Second World War. The freelance undercover journo who was working through these networks was an ethnic Han Chinese, so was obviously therefore in a lot of danger doing so. We had to write up a massive safety protocol for what he did, also using encrypted communications, the sort that Safa has been speaking about, as obviously all phones, electronic messaging, including email, were likely to be intercepted or hacked or tested using vocal recognition. In addition to doing that, we actually got undercover into some of the companies inside GIJN that were making the new era software, so companies like Leon and Huawei, essentially the companies that were buying the future and monetizing what are essentially new repressive instruments of surveillance, not just in GIJN, but around the world. So I'll show you the first 2 minutes 45 of that. There you go.
We'd love to see the whole thing, but yeah.
Yeah, you only get a snippet, so I can screen share it.
Uzak düşkemiz var kendine aldım. Anneciğim kızlarla mı olsun, kayıp anda aldı yok. Bunda cimci dur gitti, anda da bunda iş bana yapma.
I asked the Chinese government, where is my brother?
There is no justifiable reason that Xinjiang authorities can detain my father.
My sister, who you have abducted 5 months ago. I need to know if she's alive or not.
My mother was taken away by Chinese authorities to a concentration camp.
When you look at the satellite photos, it's haunting. Over and over again, these enormous compounds. In terms of the infrastructure, the number of people that can be held at any one time, this is unprecedented.
İnsan sanılışını etiketti. Bu xuddi fan texnik o'rinlarda chashqanni sinab qo'ygandek.
这个具体的不方便多说，因为这个很多安防这方面它是涉及到涉密的，它是涉密的。有的时候你可能看到觉得这个摄像只是一个摄像头，但是你始终不知道它可能会对你这个人，你在摄像头下面嘴过去，它会有你所有的信息。 他们会不会觉得人权是有干涉？
没有人权，没有人就是干涉，他没有人权。
Okay, so as you can probably tell, that was a very that would require an enormous amount of work. The film's about an hour long, and obviously it involved an enormous amount of security. And I think what I'm trying to emphasize with that is, I think various people before have emphasized, you know, it's good to specialize, and that's true. You know, there are. I think to some extent that's a story that's probably obviously now extremely familiar to people, but sometimes even then, although we put this out early last year, I think being able to aggregate something and actually show it to people in its with a full impact is actually just as valuable, particularly if you can get inside and add to that by getting inside things like the digital corporations themselves that were doing this work. So you hear from them how they see it and how they think they can make money out of it. It adds a great deal. I think what I'm trying to get at there is it's the ambition, and that requires lots and lots of parts to a sort of a big jigsaw. And I think particularly for investigations, international investigations like that, that's really how it's going to work. I think in this age of, particularly of the big, well-financed streamers like Netflix, you know, there is money to basically get a big take on those sorts of stories. Now, I have got another 2-minute thing, if I could just show, very similar, and I hope at least it would sort of, I'm sorry to go on, but I hope it would sort of give people a sense of what we're looking for, which saves me a lot of time. This is similar to that. This is on the same model. This is from 2016, and this time it focuses on Saudi Arabia and the contradictions of the West policy towards it. And I'll just show you, combining undercover footage and UGC from a network of activists and archive, basically how we opened that as well.
There is a state which beheads and even crucifies its citizens, where those who question its authority are lashed and locked up for years. A state where women lack many basic rights, patrolled by religious police, where children are indoctrinated, but this is not the Islamic State. This is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A close ally which buys billions of pounds worth of British arms, whose security forces we equip and train, even though they're in conflict with many of their own people, whose oil we buy, and whose royals get the red carpet treatment.
We have a relationship with Saudi Arabia because we receive from them important intelligence and security information that keep us safe.
Working with a team of Saudi undercover cameramen, this film sets out to penetrate one of the world's most secretive and repressive states.
The women, they're in prison, they just fear freedom.
Because of American and European support to the Saudi monarchy, our people have suffered.
And we will uncover how Saudi money and ideology has helped drive terrorism around the world.
I think there's a very real threat that the ideology that comes from there is posing to us. Morally, we need to make a stand. I think that the chickens are coming out to roost on this one.
In January 2015, the Union Jack was flown at half-mast in Westminster.
You're starting the film, aren't you?
No, let's go run this.
For a close ally. The Saudi ruler, King...
Sorry, I forgot to kill it. Well, those are the clips anyway.
Thank you, Tom.
What I would say with that is, again, what I'm trying to do is focus, what we're trying to do here is try and focus stories, in our case, to the UK, so that they get sort of wider international contradictions. That was remade for a US audience as well by WGBH Frontline. Obviously, you know, it's quite a striking piece. Those chickens haven't exactly come home to roost wildly quickly. It should be pointed out, and obviously many of the issues. Some of you, maybe Safa will recognise Lujain Hathlul was actually being interviewed in there, and she's now in prison in Saudi still. As someone who's spoken out on women's issues, particularly about the right to drive. So look, what I'd say about all of that is that even before the coronavirus, which obviously is the network and the framework around which we're talking today, you as freelancers are already working in systems where you're having to take on financial and other risks. And obviously, all those sort of tools that you're talking about, networking, developing creative ideas, building skills, they're always key to making it as a freelancer. And clearly that isn't going to change because of this. If anything, it's just intensifying to ensure that you can maintain a flow of work. And you just essentially, from my perspective, need to keep building on that and improving, as you can probably see there, the sort of range of skill sets that you might have in terms of filming with phones, filming with small cameras that would actually help a television commissioner specifically, like myself. In terms of budgeting, just to round off the whole thing, I'd say that despite the obvious drop in advertising, and ITV is a commercial company, we get all our money from advertising, whether that's digital or on television, although we do have a studio that's a production arm, which also brings in commissions, but they've had a lot of trouble making normal programs, let alone these programs, that broadly we've been able to keep commissioning for the sort of reasons I've outlined, because of the importance of the story and the public service need to do it, and have so far managed to keep those budgets fairly focused and fairly intact. Now, that may well change, but the sort of work that you've seen there, I'm hopeful, I'm sure, given what we're commissioning anyway now, that that's the sort of work we'd still like to keep doing, running into 2021 and beyond. And to do that, we're going to need, obviously, the help of freelancers like yourselves. No matter how critical things may seem now, we're still going to need this sort of work and that sort of quality of work. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for that. And I hope any other commissioning editors and people in commissioning positions listening to this webinar will take up your call to keep commissioning from great investigative freelancers, many of whom are sitting on this webinar today. So thank you. That was really interesting, Tom. And nice, actually, I think the first time we've seen film clips in one of our webinars, which was rather wonderful. Thank you. Eunice, you've joined us. We've got, I think, 4 rounds of questions, I believe, from the audience. Yeah, so fire away. Thanks.
Yes, there have been so many questions, but I guess the first thing on people's mind is obviously payment, because Emmanuel was talking at length about research, and they are asking, at what stage of your research is it a good idea to pitch your story? Because if the research required you to fly somewhere, travel somewhere, do you get an advance payment of honorarium beforehand to cover your flights, accommodation costs? Or when you say research, do you mean do all the research online? There's also one thing that Emmanuel mentioned, that there's a possibility of spending thousands on expenses like flight and hotels. So as a freelance investigative journalist, are you often expected to pay for these things out of pocket? Or should we adjust contracts so that freelancers are paid for their research time plus the publication bonus instead of dealing with word counts and kill fees? And the last part, one of the worst parts of being a freelancer is getting paid and doing all this administrative work. So how do you guys organize your numbers in order, track the payments and deal with international outlets with different payment policies? Basically, how much time do you spend on non-journalism work as a freelancer? And what are your strategies for getting it all organized? Any software you recommend?
Wow, that's quite a lot. Emmanuel, did you catch those all? Let's start with you, and then others please jump in with other suggestions. So Emmanuel, do you want to kick off? There's about 4 questions there, I think.
Yeah, I think so. There's one kind of overall question about when to pitch a story in terms of the research that you're doing. So I never, I won't spend money. I definitely won't spend a flight on the story before it's commissioned. The strategy is basically to do enough research so that you can say that I want to do a story about, like if it was a story on the Uyghurs, for example, I have this access, I want to do this story, this is why it's important, but you wouldn't go and do the filming yourself before you have the editor, agree to that they'll publish the story. And then in terms of so the trick is to do enough research. That's what I was trying to explain, to do enough research that you'll be able to do the story confidently, and you can sell the story with certainty, not end up not being able to do it. But I wouldn't spend more than great maximum I'd do is like a week of desk-based research altogether, initially. And there's also in the GIJN guide, there's a whole section about how not to get your story stolen, not to get too much information after you've done that week of research and you had the idea. And one of the way, of course, is to have unique access. But if you don't have, that unique access, and your story is something that can be easily could be done by someone else, then you have to be a bit careful with what you share, but you still want to know that for sure you're going to be able to do at least a minimum version of that story. And in terms of so I definitely wouldn't spend money on the story before I've started. Also, if you do get your flight paid for one investigation, you can also use the notes, or depending, do that transparently, but basically either stay a bit longer, or maybe some of the interviews that you've done could be useful to another stories, and you can kind of repackage what you have and sell it to someone else. Again, like being transparent, not doing that behind the back of anyone. In terms of the when to get money, especially if I'm gonna spend any cost, usually for stories where you don't spend cost, you get paid at the end. But if I'm gonna spend any cost, I definitely want to have an advance. And it's usually, if it's a big investigation, it's good to have advance that also kind of guarantees you that the outlet is serious about getting that story, and is not gonna tell you after 2 months of work that, oh, actually this is not the right time for us. So yeah, in terms of organizing for like software, I use like software that takes bills. With my smartphones, I can take photos of the bills. There's like a bunch of software that do that, and same thing for invoices and so on. There's a bunch of different ones that you can get. I guess it's everyone's preference which ones they use.
Great. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm going to contradict Emmanuel on this, because I don't see developing stories as a linear thing. You are constantly developing different stories. I have a story I'm going to finally start working on now that I've been researching on and off for 5 years. Like, I think with good investigative stories, Emmanuel is right, but like, how do you guarantee that nobody else is going to steal it? It's because even though the story may be well known, for example, you have a niche of understanding, of access, of a hook into a story. And so sometimes rushing into pitching it when it's not the right time because you're not ready is a disaster for you, because you don't fully understand the depth of that story. And so for a really good investigative story, I think you'll have to think of different things happening at the same time, and they will happen when they're meant to be happening for you. I invest a lot in my development. I will fly somewhere when, the good old days when you could fly somewhere, where it's invaluable to have a face-to-face conversation with someone to kind of get, especially if they're tricky stories, of how solid is the source, how good is the story. And so I would, obviously, financial issues aside, to me, it's important to be able to build solid relationships before I even pitch. But my niche is a country, as a region. So I can afford to multitask, and I fly for one thing and I'm developing other things in the same location. And this is where the nice thing about grants is that you can multitask these things. And you can piggyback a grant on one thing to start developing others. And so you're not losing money necessarily, but you're not just doing the one story. I think it's financially impossible to just do the linear. You develop a story for a week and then you pitch it and then you do it, and then that at least for me, that's never happened. And even with multiple stories happening like developing at the same time, I'm still caught with no project whatsoever. Like you really can't control these pitches, especially if you're doing the deeper, longer form stuff in film, where you kind of have to do a recce. You have to go shoot something to show them, or prove that you have that. So I think with print, it's a lot easier, but with film, you really do have to invest a lot more. And it's a lot trickier to land that pitch.
Okay, thank you for that. Cecilia, you're about to say something, yeah?
Very quickly, I agree with Safa on the multitasking thing, even if you don't do film. So like for the first slow travel we did after, well, it's not really after the pandemic, but let's say after the lockdown, it was financed by one grant, but we ended up doing a trip for 6 different stories. So like you try to go to different sources and things. And I know sometimes it can be confusing because you have to keep everything in mind of the different stories. Maybe 6 is a bit too much, but at least if you can do 2 or 3, maybe you just have to add a few kilometers on your schedule, but I think that is worth in most cases. But clearly, if it's about buying €1,000 flights to the other end of the world, then it might be a bit too much. But if it's about, you know, somewhere where you're supposed to go anywhere anyways, then yes, it's good to try and multitask.
Okay, thank you. Eunice, another round.
Yes, the second round is more about protecting yourself. Some people ask any recommendations on health insurance policies or how to insure yourself against lawsuits and also protect oneself from government actors spying on your communication. So it's all about protection. Also, how to submit a pitch for a novel story, but at the same time, keep it from being stolen or used by the outlet that you pitch your story for.
Okay, so who would like to have I mean, the whole issue of protection is quite complex because there's health, legal, etc., etc. But would any of you like to try and answer that? Cecilia, did you want to?
I can say something on the legal part, and yeah, Bruce can.
We have some, just to say without, you know, trying to plug GIJN too much, but actually it is complicated and we do have some resources on it. It is something that one can really do more work on, though. I think it's a complicated issue, but go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, that was, it depends which country you're in, and
yeah.
it depends. Obviously, you might be writing or publishing an international story and you could get sued in a lot of different countries. But generally, I don't know, like you might want to have an insurance in your country if you write more in one country, just for what concerns civil lawsuit. But then that will not help you for the criminal court cases. And then it depends again from country to country. In some countries, you don't really have criminal lawsuits. In others, you do. Italy is a country in which we get mainly sued in criminal court. So it's good to be in touch with organizations like NGOs for the protection of journalists. There might be in something from your own country, it might be Index on Censorship, it might be a lot of different resources you on the global network are very good at listing. But I think that mainly for freelancers, what's really important is to make sure the media you're publishing with will provide you lawyers. And that's something that is not always clear at the start. So when you get commission, maybe be sure about that too. I mean, that's, at least for us, it was quite important to get the lawyers off the paper.
Good, thanks for that. Fisayo, did you have anything to add? You're working freelance now in terms of legal insurance, and what do you do about that? I think you're on mute. Yeah, thanks.
Nothing to add, actually.
Okay, thank you. That's okay. All right, and Emmanuel, did you want to add to that?
No, it's okay. I mean, legal insurance is very expensive. One of the main things that, well, there's two ways that you can prevent or like mitigate that. One is to not get sued and have very solid stories that prevent that to some extent. And the other one is make sure that in some contracts that you see with outlets, they say that if they get sued, then you'll have to pay for the court fees. And that's basically something like I'll never sign that. But I've seen that in a bunch of places. And usually you can, you know, negotiate your contracts. Just to clarify what I was saying earlier, wasn't that, you know, you should run on one story and then finish that one, then move on to the next. When I said you should spend a week is in total on, you know, researching one story. And yeah, you definitely, as a freelancer, you have to work on a bunch of different stories at the same time.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
Eunice, I will do 2 more rounds briefly, I think.
Yes, this one is about access. Someone asked, how are freelancers getting access to research tools like databases and subscription services and services of news researchers? Another one, do you find accessing or gaining the trust of sources more challenging as a freelancer? How do you navigate that? And how do you use social media to get freelance assignments? And the last one, is there pressure?
Wow, a lot of questions.
Yeah. Is there pressure on freelancers to take more COVID-19 risks in their reporting to compete with regular staff reporters?
Okay, access to research tools. Any thoughts there? That's a tough one. Depends which research tools. I guess some of them, if they're commercial, will be about the amount of money you have to spend to get access.
Yeah. I can take a crack at that. I mean, this is especially difficult in regions where they don't have these kind of databases, and you have to go abroad to, like, I talk specifically about the Arab world. So I just joined the ICIJ network, for example, to do exactly that, because they have a whole trove of data, leaked documents and things like that. But that took a long time to get there. And the other thing is, if you're working or collaborating or pitching to an institution, they might be able to get that access for you. So you have to be really creative about where you're looking for this information. So in the Arab world, you have to go to unusual locations to get that kind of data that I think in the West is a lot easier, and they're legally obligated in governments to provide that. And you have FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act, that you can force the government to give you information. So it really depends on the region. When it comes to, for example, in Yemen, I think I saw one of the Q&As, like, how do you get accurate COVID data from the Houthis, who are deliberately trying to hide the numbers, right? And it's just like, then you have to get creative about visiting hospitals, seeing what kind of resources they have, extrapolating from a small story what you think is a bigger story. And so then it's not really about the data and the numbers, but symbolic cases that can allude to the bigger thing. So not getting stuck on the numbers, because, like, we still don't even know what's the accurate number of civilians killed in Yemen in the war, because nobody's keeping count, and everybody's deliberately hiding the numbers of their own armies and militias and armed groups. So I think we need to not be as obsessed with the data as numbers and what those necessarily tell you, because you also have to have a healthy distance to what you think those numbers mean, and especially for people who do data journalism on countries that they've never been to, and so they don't understand the context, and that is really dangerous for me. It's like, this is where I become really cautious, like, how do I use this information?
Sure. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, let's move to the sort.
Forever, but
yeah,
something very useful people can go and check is called Investigative Dashboard by OCCIRPI.org. And there you have a list of a lot of online resources where you can find data.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of efforts around to try and bring more resources like that. In other words, access to data. But yeah, it's impossible as an individual. Essentially, it needs to be more organized and work with other people to do that. Right. I think this is probably going to be our last round of questions, just simply because we're running rather late. And I thank you all and the audience too for staying with us. But there are two more I think we'll end on. One is on how to use social media to get freelance gigs. I think that's an interesting question. Do people do that among our panelists? Or Fisayo, you spoke a lot about using using social media, but does it actually? Do you actually use it to, in a sense, pitch work, which was the question?
Actually, I do. So basically, as I said earlier, if you use social media to report all the time, you build an audience, and then you check the new followers you're getting. So for me, if I get a new follower on Twitter and I see the person is a journalist, person is a commission, an editor, a publisher, I follow back and I send a message to connect. So I build relationships on social media, because the person followed me for a reason, which is the kind of work I do. So I don't wait till I meet them. I create a meeting point already. Then when it's time to pitch an idea, I send them an email, I send them a message inbox. So yes, it's very possible to use social media to get freelancing opportunities. But in addition, I've come to notice, also because of the tone of this conversation, that a lot of freelance journalists think the only way they can get money is for their stories, think they can only make money by selling their stories. But no, there are times when you write, you report just to create opportunities that are media related, but not necessarily reporting. So for instance, a company reaches out to you and says, we want you to come and give us a training on how we can be mindful of COVID-19 and what we can do, how we can do our work without getting endangered. We see that you've done a lot of COVID-19 reporting. You've reported banks, you've reported filling stations, telcos. You've done a lot of reporting with organizations. And based on your experience, what do you think we can learn from you? That's not reporting, but that's an opportunity you get because you reported. Some will ask you, we need someone who can consult for us on some idea, maybe not COVID related, but something that you've reported before. For instance, I once did a story on a popular psychiatric hospital in Nigeria, neuropsychiatric hospital Yaba, popularly known as Yaba Left. And I was there undercover for 10 days. But recently, an agency came and said, we are trying to do something on drug abuse. You spent time at a psychiatric hospital taking care of people living with drug abuse and people with mental illness. From your experience, can you do this for us? Non-media job, but because of a media opportunity. Sorry, a media reporting I did. So I like people to think of opportunities, not just with what they can get from their story, but non-reporting opportunities that reporting can't fetch them. And a lot of that happens on social media.
Great, thank you for that. The last question we had, which I'm going to preempt, I'm sorry to the person who asked it, was about whether there's higher risks at the moment for freelancers because of COVID. And a number of our speakers actually spoke to this point. They agreed that there are much higher risks at the moment for a range of reasons: security, the fact you can get ill, access issues, and so on. So I apologize to that person that I didn't go do the rounds with our speakers, and also to people who are still asking questions. We could probably stay here for another hour or two, but we're running out of time. So I'm gonna have to stop the discussion right now, and I apologize again to people whose questions we couldn't answer. Just to end, I want to thank everybody involved in this webinar. There's a lot of people working hard behind the scenes, my colleagues at GIJN for sure. We have 3 translators who've also been working very hard. I'd like to thank really huge thanks to our speakers who spent a lot of time with us this afternoon. We're really grateful to all of them, and to Emmanuel, to Safa, to Fisayo, to Cecilia, and to Tom. Huge thank you to you all. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience for spending, many of you stayed with us for the whole time, so thanks a lot for staying and for coming, and please come to another one of our webinars. We've actually got one in 2 weeks, so on 23rd of July at the same time on a Thursday, on open source investigation in Africa, and hope some of you can join us again. So thanks again, and see you soon. Bye for now. Goodbye.